The Eastern European steppes continued to be the scene of the modern world's old Soviet clashes between Ukrainian and Russian troops. While trench warfare continues to decrease in Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, it increases in settlements such as Severnovokuznetsk, Verkhovka in the woodlands and camouflage forest areas of Luhansk. Both trench warfare and strategic point-and-shoot attack operations come to the fore. Currently, the areas where activity is experienced in Luhansk include the residential areas up to Kreminna, start of Kreminna Bridge and Stanitsia Luhanska. The Ukrainian armed forces are trying to focus on other front lines in the region while defending Kreminna state against the Russians with their hard fortified areas. The fact that the region is covered with forest lands is among the factors that facilitate this goal of Ukrainians. In addition, volunteer legionnaires working in the operational and intelligence fields for the Ukrainian army are another important factor contributing to this goal. Considering all this, it is not difficult to guess that the Ukrainians will already carry out an offensive operation in this region, especially a few days ago. The military activity along the front line between Kreminna Bridge and Stanitsia Luhanska increased the odds that the Ukrainians would make an attempt. In addition, the increase of the Ukrainian Air Force's sorties on the Luhansk front line was another sign of this situation. So even the Russian troops in Luhansk seemed to expect the Ukrainian armed forces to launch either a drone attack or a missile attack using the Air Force. Vladimir Putin's army had recently started to increase its military supplies, both from the Russian border and from the front lines close to Luhansk. It was clear that something was going to happen. Finally, the expected attack from the Ukrainian army took place. A Su-24 bomber of the Ukrainian Air Force carried out a low flight and launched a missile attack on the Luhanskteplovoz facilities, which Russian troops used as a command and military equipment repair center. During the sortie carried out by the Su-24 bomber, a total of 4 explosions were heard at the Luhanskteplovoz facilities. Local residents said that the explosions were so severe that they were deafening. But the most striking aspect of the attack was that the Su-24 bomber fired UK-made Stormy Shadow missiles at the Luhanskteplovoz facility. The Ukrainian pilot had hit the target from 12. A massive fire broke out shortly after on the Luhanskteplovoz facility, which was hit by Stormy Shadow missiles. The Russian base in Luhansk was the largest main headquarters of the Russian army in Ukraine. When Ukrainian warplanes blow up the Russian rear front headquarters with Stormy Shadow from 250 kilometers, it will disrupt all operations of the Russian army in the east. Very striking images emerged of the Ukrainian forces destroying the Russian home base with incredible tactics. Video of the attack showed huge columns of smoke rising eerily over the city as massive explosions rang out. It was known that important Russian military equipment was located in this facility. Presumably, the Ukrainian Su-24 pilot also carried out accurate shots at the ammunition depot at the facility. The former locomotive factory, Luhanskteplovoz, was looted by Russian forces in 2015 before it was converted into a Russian military command center and equipment repair center. Since then, Russian troops have been using the facility as a command center rather than an equipment repair area. For this reason, it is thought that important Russian commanders may have been killed after the Stormy Shadow missile attack carried out by the Ukrainian Air Force using Su-20. For fighter jets, the Russian army could not intervene immediately after this attack. This was due to the absence of assault brigades in the areas close to the Luhanskteplovoz facility. In these areas, there were mostly amateur units of volunteers mobilized into the Russian army. Likewise, the Ukrainian army has volunteer military units on the front lines in and around Luhansk. But the volunteer units of Ukrainians conduct only intelligence operations in some specific areas of Luhansk. In other words, the Ukrainian volunteer units may have provided the critical data of the attack by the Ukrainian Air Force on Luhanskteplovoz. It is unclear who provided the strategic coordinates of the facility and how many Russian soldiers are housed there. The Ukrainian Air Force's attack on Luhanskteplovoz deprive the Russians of a crucial military resource and command center. Russian soldiers will no longer be able to repair their guns and tanks, which could give Ukraine a crucial advantage when trying to retake Luhansk. In addition, it seems that the pressure of the Ukrainians in Luhansk will increase thanks to this attack. If you remember, the Ukrainian forces carried out a major offensive operation in Burka recently and captured a large part of this settlement. After this operation, the Ukrainians wanted to create an attack corridor between Donetsk and Luhansk. The Ukrainian army, which managed to move towards the Luhansk line after Markivka, is now successfully carrying out their plans by attacking the Luhanskteplovoz facility. The Russians do not have a strong and regular military unit that can launch a counterattack in these areas. The closest military unit of the Russian army to the facility is the 1st Guards Tank Army. There is also the 993rd Anti-Aircraft Battalion near this facility, but neither Russian unit is close enough to intervene. In short, the Ukrainian forces started to get what they wanted on the front lines after Donetsk. So what will happen in Donbass now? The influence of the big offensive plans of the Ukrainians has proven to cover much wider areas with the missile attacks on the facility used by the Russians in Luhansk. While there is no sharp activity in Bakhmut, Marinka and Solder at the moment, the fact that Ukrainians turned to Luhansk may be a sign that offensive operations and clashes will continue in this region. In addition, the severity of offensive operations on critical front lines such as Kreminna and Starkov may increase in the coming days. Ukrainian attacks on the Luhanskteplovoz facility could also trigger insurgent attacks near the Russian borderline. The aim may be to put Russian troops in a dilemma in these regions. Therefore, attacks can be organized simultaneously. We can witness the offensive actions of the Free Legion groups supporting the Ukrainian army on the Ukrainian-Russian border lines in the same time period. Heavy repressive attack of the Ukrainian armed forces against Russian troops in Luhansk may also occur, so the Ukrainians can try to squeeze the Russians from both directions. Vladimir Putin's nightmare is coming true. The winds of the war in Ukraine continue to blow on Russian soil. One of Putin's biggest fears was that the war he started would spread to his own country. The effects of the Ukrainian war are felt more and more in the depths of Russia. The Kiev fighters seem determined to carry their successes on the front lines to the Russian border. Since the beginning of the war, Ukrainian forces have repeatedly conducted offensive operations against Russian cities close to the border lines. These included cities such as Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod, especially Bryansk, which is located at the westernmost tip of Russia and shares a border with the northeastern tip of Ukraine, is at the focal point of the attacks. Cases of treason and espionage are on the rise in Russia. Moscow tightens its laws against sabotage, but measures have been failing to stop a large number of attacks in recent weeks. Explosions that derailed trains, cut power lines, and mysterious fires. The increased sabotage actions in Russia this week overshadow the preparations for the May 9th World War II Victory Day, the most important celebration of Moscow. President Vladimir Putin has sought to portray Russia as a safe and stable country, as soldiers have been fighting in Ukraine for over a year and the death toll has risen. Russian officials tried to recruit more men to replenish the weakened ranks. Authorities tried to reassure those at home that the conflict was distant and did not pose a threat to Russian soil. However, a series of explosions in recent days reminded that Russia was also exposed to enemy blows even hundreds of kilometers away from the Ukrainian front. Let's dive into the details of the explosions in Russian cities. Local authorities reported that an explosion occurred for the second time in 2 days after a freight train derailed in the Bryansk region on the border with Ukraine. Regional Governor Alexander Bogomazov stated that an explosive device exploded near the train station in Znamenskaya, about 96 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Bogomazov stated that the explosion did not cause any death or injury. In the statement made by the train operator Russian Railways, it was reported that a locomotive and about 20 wagons were derailed. Russian railways stated that about 100 meters of railway tracks should be replaced about 330 ft immediately after the explosions. A fire train was dispatched to the scene. However, the first videos of the train derailed on the internet did not show any flames. It was not immediately clear what the train was carrying. The governor made no specific charges for the explosion in which two trains derailed. Kiev maintains an overall policy of strategic uncertainty regarding attacks on Russian territory. Ukraine also did not take responsibility for the explosions. The previous derailment occurred as a freight train from Belarus passed through the Bryansk region near the town of Uneker, about 96 kilometers east of the Ukrainian border. The explosion was the last blatant sabotage attack to occur in Russia. 8 of the train's 78 cars were derailed after an explosive device was detonated. The derailed wagon caught fire, closing the traffic on the line. Ribber, an influential pro-Russian military blog, posted a video on Telegram showing cars burning. Rebar noted that the wagons carried petroleum products and timber. Explosions in Russian cities are incessant. Earlier this week, another explosive device damaged power lines in a forest south of St. Petersburg. The FSB security service described it as an act of sabotage. In addition, in the last 5 days, 2 fuel tanks caught fire in and around the Crimean Peninsula. A Russian official reported that an oil depot near the strategically important Kerch Strait Bridge, which connects Russia with Crimea, burned down in the early hours. Veniamin Kondratiev, the governor of the Krasnodar region, said on his Telegram channel that an oil storage tank caught fire in the village of Volna, near the port of Taman. Volga is Russia's only land link with the illegally annexed peninsula of Crimea. Volna is located near the Kerch Strait Bridge, an important supply route for Russian forces amid the ongoing war in Ukraine. The latest fire came days after Russia blamed Ukraine for another fire at an oil depot in the port of Sevastopol. The fire started around 2:30 am, Moscow time. It was claimed that the fire was caused by an unmanned aerial vehicle belonging to Kiev. Videos of the fire spread rapidly. Leon, Russian and Ukrainian social media video footage showed a large flame and a large black smoke rising into the sky. Anton Gerashenko, one of the advisors of the Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, shared a 28-second video on social media platforms. Gerashenko suggested that the fire may have been part of Ukraine's preparations for the upcoming offensive. Gerashenko stated that weakening Russia's logistics is important for counterattack operations. Alexei Oreskovich, who served as an advisor to the Ukrainian presidency until he resigned in January, claimed earlier this week that Kiev's counterattack would target the Kerch Bridge. The days in Crimea never returned to normal. Explosions and fires raised tensions in Crimea. Every minute before the explosions in the village of Volna, the port city in Crimea was also shaken by a series of explosions. The oil storage facility, with a capacity of 40,000 tons in the city of Sevastopol, was hit by unmanned aerial vehicles. A bright explosion turned night into day in Sevastopol, then darkened the sky as a Russian fuel tank burned during the day after a Ukrainian drone strike. The reported kamikaze drone attack set several fuel storage tanks on fire at a large fuel terminal at the western end of Sevastopol. The complex in Kazanka Bay formed a rising cloud of black smoke before it burned, leaving behind charred tanks and pipelines. Moscow's appointed governor of Crimea, Mikhail Rostov-Sev, made a statement on his Telegram account stating that 2 drones caused the fire. Preliminary information TASS news agency reported that the fire covered approximately 21,500. According to Osmayev, there were 60 firefighters trying to control the fire. However, the fire was brought under control about 14 hours after it started. Governor Rosvozchev also stated that no one was injured and those living nearby would not be evacuated. Roswell's Hajiyev added that the fire will not affect the refueling situation in Sevastopol. Also, video from a drone used to investigate damage to the facility shows multiple fuel tanks being completely destroyed. In the images, it's observed that some tanks that do not burn themselves have serious thermal damage. The damage appears significant and likely jeopardizes plant operations in the near future. Whatever the potential impact on operations, no Russian supply officer would want so much fuel and infrastructure to evaporate. The problem is not the fuel lost, but the loss of the ability to conserve large amounts of fuel in the future. The Ukrainian Armed Forces announced in a statement that the attack on an oil reserve in the Russian-annexed region of Crimea is part of preparations for the upcoming spring counter-offensive. On the other hand, Ukraine can counterattack at any moment. Considering this possibility, Russia is increasing its measures. In addition to strengthening its defense lines, Moscow is canceling its important celebrations. The May 9th parades have also been cancelled in more remote Russian regions outside of major cities near the Ukrainian border. For now, the main parade on Red Square in Moscow will still continue. The main challenge for the authorities is to ensure that everything goes smoothly. The parade, broadcast all over Russia and demonstrating the military might of Moscow, is the main event of the year and is crucial to Putin's legitimacy. The parade often gathers crowds who come to watch the tanks and soldiers marching through Moscow with their families. Since coming to power in 2000, Putin has promoted a cult of patriotism that was used to fuel patriotism around the Soviet victory over the Nazis in 1945 and boost his legitimacy as the heir to the Soviet power. It seems that Ukraine's offensive operations have not only affected Russian cities. These operations also undermine the prestige of the Russian leader. We will wait and see what the Russian leader's reaction to Kiev's operations will be. One of the most important fights is taking place in the Luhansk region, in particular near Kreminna. It is extremely important for the Ukrainians to establish control over this town because taking it can solve almost all Ukrainian problems in the east. And here is why. First of all, by breaching the Russian defense in Kreminna, the Ukrainians will be able to rapidly take Severodonetsk and Lysychansk into a pocket by collapsing the Lysychansk group. The Ukrainians would also gain access to the rear of the Solidar group, meaning the Russians would be forced to stop offensive actions immediately and regroup. On top of that, many Russian troops will be moved back to stabilize the front line because the Ukrainians will be expanding eastward. Secondly, the defense lines that the Russians erected to the north and south of Svatov will be rendered useless as the Ukrainians will just move around them and encircle one town on the line after another. Thirdly, by moving past Kreminna, the Ukrainians cut off some of the most important Russian ground lines of communication, such as the highway that goes through Svatov and connects Russian Lysychansk, and also the railroad that connects Russia and Luhansk. Moreover, they will open more possibilities for themselves to supply the eastern group from Kharkiv. Ukrainian officials declared that the Ukrainians launched an offensive operation right before the new year. Since then, there have been 2 periods of freezing temperatures, several weeks in total, when the Ukrainians could increase the intensity of their attacks. As many of you already noted, the task turned out to be more difficult than expected, and there are 2 reasons for that. Firstly, heavy fights around Bakhmut and Soledar put a strain on Ukrainian reserves as some troops were relocated south to speed up the rotation process and reinforce weak points. Secondly, the Russians understand the value of Kreminna as well, which is why they deployed a lot of troops for defense. Both parties concentrated up to 100,000 troops on this 60-kilometer segment of the front line, which is a significant portion of both armies. Nonetheless, despite the slow progress, there have still been a lot of changes in this region. Last time I told you that the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of Dybrova and concentrated their efforts on attacking through the forest. I also noted that despite the fact that the Russians were pushed out of Dniprovo, the Ukrainians did not move in, as it is under tight surveillance and everyone there is met with rapid artillery fire. Ukrainian artillery is also very active. The spokesman for the Eastern Group of Forces has constantly been reporting about the destruction of ammunition depots around Kreminna, fuel storage facilities and command posts, and this interdiction campaign brought some results. First of all, Russian commanders basically abandoned Kreminna and moved to Rubizh. Secondly, Russian tanks started to experience shortages of fuel and lubricants, which affected the number of tanks that they could deploy at one time. And as the Luhansk region is the area of responsibility of the 1st Guards Tank Army, the Russians relocated a lot of tanks here. The Russians have released many videos featuring their hangars with dozens of tanks. So Ukrainian intelligence and artillery are constantly working on identifying and destroying these warehouses. Apart from artillery duels, a lot of action takes place in the forest. The Ukrainian side has published a lot of videos of forest battles which show high-intensity fighting. This goes along with various reports of Ukrainian progress from all sides. Ukrainian sources report that the Ukrainians are very close to the southern outskirts of Kreminna. A boss, 13 commander, claimed that Ukrainian forces are constantly probing Russian defensive positions south of Kreminna, and around a week ago, a Russian source published footage showing Russian forces fighting against a Russian assault in the vicinity of Kreminna. The Russian Ministry of Defense indirectly confirmed that Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups operate near Kuzmin. The British Ministry of Defense noted that Ukrainian forces are continuing to advance on the eastern edge of Kreminna. In order to counteract Ukrainian efforts, the Russians are doing three things. Firstly, according to the Ukrainian head of the Luhansk region, Russian forces have begun to deploy more experienced military personnel rather than more mobilized personnel to fight in the Kreminna area due to the fears that the Russian forces may lose the settlement. These reinforcements include a substantial number of Wagner Group personnel as well as Russian airborne forces. Secondly, instead of purely defending their positions, the Russians are imposing constant counter battles when both parties are attacking each other simultaneously. This is obviously a very costly tactic because if the Russians were just defending, they would have smaller losses. But it is effective in the way that it does slow down Ukrainian progress a lot. Thirdly, the Russians are trying to undermine Ukrainian defense in Bilohorivka and destroy all the pontoon crossings leading to the forest, although here they are the least successful. Overall, the most successful axis of Ukrainian advance has been the forest. Many sources indicate that the Ukrainians are reaching the eastern edges of Kreminna and defensive positions nearby. Artillery is playing a key role as well and made some very well fortified positions simply untenable. The fact that the Russian command was moved away from the city is also a very good signal. If the Ukrainians manage to develop the same success to the north of Kreminna as well, then the Ukrainians can start storming the city.